This podcast is brought to you by True Resources, connecting talented people with the best mining employers in the Australian market. For more information, head to trueresources.com.au. So hello, I'm Ben Kostrich and this is the Market Bull podcast. Joining me today on the show is Peter Allen, the Managing Director of Firebird Metals, which is listed on the ASX under code FRB. It's in the manganese sector or resources, and in particular about batteries. And that's a lot of the conversation today we'll focus on. But welcome back to the show, Peter.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here.
We last spoke probably roughly 12 months ago, and I'd urge listeners to go back and listen to that one. It talks a little bit about what the company is, yourself and the board and a lot of other features. But naturally, a lot has happened over the last 12 months. But in a quick, compressed version, what is Firebird Metals for those that have never heard of it before?
Okay, look, Firebird is a manganese-focused exploration and development play. We listed in March 21. We were principally focused on our Oakover project to start with. That's 85 k's east of Newman. We grew a big resource there. It's 177 million tonnes JORC, 106 million tonnes in indicated. We took what was in the ground, we converted it into a concentrate that is good for manganese in the steel industry. Steel is its long-term consumer. Very strong fundamentals going forward on steel. But what we see is where all the excitement is in terms of manganese in batteries. So we always had the ambition to take that concentrate, turn it into high-purity manganese sulfate for battery cathodes. We did that about a year ago, and then we worked out what is the best way, or we started to work out what was the best way to bring that strategy forward. We did a lot of travel in the first half of last year into China once China opened up after COVID. What really became incredibly evident from that was the benefits you can get out of being a producer in China. They have these industrial parks that are like I call them like circular industries, where one part of the business in the park will deliver a residue that it becomes your feedstock. Your residue becomes somebody else's feedstock. And so it drives this massive cost benefit and low capital intensity benefit. So that gave birth 12 months ago, back to your question, of our LMFP strategy. So that was building a manganese sulfate plant in China with a long-term aspiration of taking Oakover feed into that plant and into other plants as we grow. So that's what we've been busy working on. And so since then, we've delivered scoping studies, feasibility studies, a pilot plant in China. We've done investor tours to our pilot plant and location in China. So it's been a really busy 12 months and lots of good things happening and building a really good business case. And a very exciting 12 months ahead of us as well. Yeah,
we'll go into the batteries in depth very shortly, but I wanted to get your understanding of what initially is happening within the manganese market. I know a lot of us are tracking indexes across all the commodities, and it's a bit, tough for quite a few of us, but I like to know from people that are in the industry what's really unfolding with supply-demand metrics and what's really happening with other players and companies in the industry. And I guess your focus now you've got the Andover and Oakover, and you've got the battery facility or the processing in China. So that's like a double-pronged attack. But talk us about the sort of thematics of the manganese sector at the moment.
Yeah, so look, I think the thematics in manganese are strong on both major steel side. Manganese is unsubstitutable in steel. It's a anti-corrosive, oxidizing agent, desulfurizing agent. You can't replace it in steel production. What's interesting that's happened in the last few months in terms of the feedstock that goes into steel is, South 32's Groot Island project got hit by a cyclone Megan about March this year. Very unfortunately for them, good for the market, they damaged the port was damaged, their infrastructure was damaged. And they were a significant producer. They were that mine's been in operation for 50-odd years, and it is like the tier one mine in the industry. It is coming to the end of its life. I think they've publicly said that by 2030, it's going to be starting to run out of resource. But they were producing 6 million tonnes a year, and 6 million tonnes of high grade material a year. So that really created a massive hole in the manganese ore supply side for the steel industry. You've seen now, they've come out and said they're looking at maybe restarting shipments in Q3 of financial year 25, so March next year. So it's like a good 12 months they're going to be out of shipments for. So when you think total manganese market is like 50 million tonnes, but that's of all grades, ranging from like 25 to 40, 50%. So when you think 6 million tonnes at 42, 43% manganese, it's a good substantial 14, 15% of the market just disappeared overnight. So you've seen manganese ore prices run. There have been some supply responses from South Africa. Different mineralisation though from South Africa, like what they have in Groote Eylandt is an oxide ore. What is predominantly in South Africa is a semi-carbonate ore, which both are very usable, but just different processing routes, and then they're having different processes and pricing mechanisms to get there. So on steel, that to me that just demonstrates that there's a need for more projects like Oakover to come through the system.
Yeah.
If there's not that latent capacity in the system, you're going to hit these significant supply shortages as it goes through if these events happen. On the battery side, so manganese has always been used in alkaline batteries through electrolytic manganese dioxide, EMD, but that's been a very, very small market. Like traditionally, less than 1% of total manganese consumption has gone into batteries. What's happened with lithium-ion batteries is now manganese is being used in the form of manganese sulfate, high-purity manganese sulfate, and we're going from a very small base, like 10 years ago, consumption was 20,000 tonnes. Today, it's 400,000 to 500,000 tonnes. Forecast to go by the end of this decade to 5 million tonnes, in my opinion. Principally driven by China. So you think, and that's part of the reason why we've chosen to build our sulfate plant in China, is because yes, the Western world is catching up, and yes, the Western world will switch on, but the forecast we see, it's 2028, 2030 by the time that happens. We see there's an opportunity to catch that demand and uprise in demand in China over the next 5 years and meet that demand. And so, like I said, if you compare building this plant in Western world, there's peers out there looking to build these plants, a similar plant to us in the US and in Europe. Their capital intensity is, if not 3 or 4 times as much as ours, significantly more capital. Our estimated or projected capital is, $83 million US. The next cheapest is $290 million US, going all the way up to $750 million.
Yeah, that's a decent increase quickly.
Absolutely huge increase, and like I was talking about before, this circular industry drives your OPEX as well, and so our operating costs, in China, we think is about half of what the Western world's operating costs are going to be. So, so really giving you that demand, and so that's where we sort of see the big growth. And it's not simple like in terms of the steel side where you bring on a new mine. Bringing on a new mine is not simple, but it's not a chemical process that you actually have to have the technology, have to have all the reagents, you have to have all the key ingredients to make it. It's not just you see the demand one day and you can build into it. We're very excited about the batteries. No matter what type of battery it is, or battery cathode it is in the future, manganese is growing in importance. So the traditional nickel-based ternary batteries, NCM, so nickel, cobalt, manganese. Manganese is starting to play a more important role with that. There's a real driver in the world to make EVs a lower cost, to make them more acceptable or more available to the greater market. And the way to do that is reduce your battery costs. And like the key costs in your battery costs is your cathode cost. And so when you think manganese is, in your typical NCM, it's like 1% to 2% of that cathode cost. So, you have car manufacturers like Volkswagen, Stellantis, Tesla, all saying, we want to increase manganese content. And so, you're now getting these, what they call NMXs or manganese rich, so like NCM 307, so 30% nickel, 0 cobalt, 70% manganese. So that's more the traditional side. You've then got lithium solid state batteries that are coming through as forecast in the future. They're very intensive on manganese consumption. So remember, manganese is a key part of that. Sodium based battery cathodes, also manganese is very intensive in that. So it's a key part of that. And the thing that we get really excited about is, there's always been this battle between nickel-based batteries and lithium-ion phosphate batteries. Limited range or lower range on lithium-ion phosphate, but the crystalline structure in it is much safer. It has a higher thermal runaway and much cheaper to produce, about a third of a nickel-based battery. So what China's been doing is they've been working on management systems, BYD and their blade technology. They're getting greater range, but now they've worked out by adding manganese into LFP to make LMFP, you get a 15 to 20% energy density uptick. Your cost base basically stays flat. You're swapping iron sulfate for manganese sulfate, and you then start to get the best of both worlds. You get the energy density of a nickel-based battery, but you start to get the cost benefits, the safety benefits of a lithium iron phosphate-based battery.
And that's primarily through the manganese sort of addition, or
correct?
Yeah.
And the other big downfall of LFP is its extreme cold weather. Poor performance. Like when it gets to minus 20, minus 30, their range and their capacity just falls off a cliff, basically. Last year, my colleague was in the north part of China. It was minus 30. The electric vehicles that the taxis drivers were using, they had turned off all the heating, turned off all there was no radio on.
Just to make sure it could
Just to make sure the battery range would just get that last little bit out. Add in manganese, and you start getting greater cold weather performance as well.
So there's quite a few benefits there, really.
Yeah.
With reducing the price, increasing the range, and then also its ability to withstand cold temperatures, which are three sort of keys that I assume that the whole EV industry have been looking for to solve.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think it all comes back to is, EVs are sort of moving from being that more of a premium product into a bulk product, and to do that, you need to drive your costs down. And, in terms of cathode, manganese is the answer to that.
And we're already seeing that with, you mentioned BYD, and I think we're seeing them a lot more, at least in Perth and even Australia, but they're coming into the market and they're showing that you can make a much more affordable electric vehicle. And I think I saw things of Elon Musk sort of laughing, being like, they'll never get there, and now being like, they're here and they're actually pretty good. Very good.
And I can't remember the exact number, but when you think BYD has now sold, I know it's more than 5 million, but maybe it's even 7 million cars, EVs. They're doing more than good. And so I think the whole LMFP strategy. It's also just worth to point out that it's not new technology. LMFP has been around since about 2012. And BYD were one of the first creators of it. But what you saw in China was, in the teens, there was more incentives from the government to use nickel-based batteries. So that really created that nickel-based drive, before the collapse in 2017, 2018. When those incentives fell away, LFP now has gone to 70% of the market. People are forecasting that LMFP will replace 50% of LFP by the end of this decade. And so, people like Sozhou Securities, well-known Chinese analysts, they're saying there's going to be anywhere between 10 to 15 million tonnes of LFP in China by the end of this decade, so 5 to 7.5 million tonnes of LMFP. To convert LMFP into manganese sulfate, like demand, you use about 0.9 of a tonne of sulfate to every 1 tonne of LMFP. So if there's 5 million tonnes of LMFP, there's 4 million tonnes of manganese sulfate.
Yeah.
So you can just sort of see, there is this massive demand coming, and again, that's why we want to position ourselves there. And the other trend, I guess, what's happening is the Chinese are now blending NCMs and LMFP. So you again, it's all about just working that, trying to find that balance,
the combinations,
correct, and just trying to get that price point, the safety point, and the range. And I think a lot of the time there's a lot of range anxiety with things like LFP, but the newer base batteries, their range is improving significantly. And I think people sort of realizing, unless you're going on extensive road trips, range anxiety is not something to be feared as much as
and I think even Stellantis, they've brought out, or they're bringing out a new model which gets nearly 1,000 kilometres. And that's because everyone went in the mindset of, it's great for European cities, and then realised that people outside of European cities drive a bit more and drive a bit longer, and that's sort of the ongoing sort of evolution of it is understanding that exact thing.
And last year, I think it was Samsung SDI announced they had developed or are developing an LMFP 1000K cathode as well. So they're all getting to that range, and again, it's all about the cost base.
So then circling in on or focusing in on rather on the strategy that you've gone down, which is now on producing this LMFP facility in China. Talk us through how those conversations started. I mean, you're 12 months down the line, you've done some scoping studies, some feasibility, and there's a lot more on that path as well as funding strategies. But paint the picture of what's been happening over the last 12 months with that.
Sure. Okay. So Wei and I, we visited a lot of industrial parks, visited other existing sulfate producers. We just tried to get a understanding. And like the original concept was to go there and work out, we had made sulfate in Australia from Oakover, but it was a bit of a complicated process. Yeah. And we thought there's got to be efficiencies, optimizations that we can do to this process. And it was really where it started was going to look for that. Then it just quickly turned around to know that like I said, once you visit these parks, you realise your cost base can come down significantly, etc. In September last year, we call it our LMFP strategy, but what we're building is 70,000 tonne equivalent manganese sulfate plant. And so that will give us 50,000 tonnes of battery-grade sulfate and 10,000 tonnes of manganese tetroxide, or Mn3O4. And so why we're producing both is there's two reasons. There's an operational advantage in doing so, and there's also looking towards the future. You can add manganese at varying points of the cathode production. So sulfate tends to go into solution in the beginning of the process. Mn3O4 tend to be a dry mix that goes into the end of the process. So that's the target. What we then set about is we completed a scoping study in China to produce those same tonnages from Oakover. But what we then realised is while we're developing Oakover, we're going through environmental permits, we're negotiating native title for production agreements and royalties. We're going through the whole process of that. That's still
ongoing
and it's a lengthy process. And we thought, if we go down that path, bring the mine on stream, then go to sulfate, we're like...
You're kicking the can 10, 20,
well, not that long, but like 5, 6, 7 years away. And then back to the original point, all the demand is here in China. Yeah. So, not here in China, but in China. Yeah. And so we thought, well, then let's look at a strategy where we keep developing Oakover. Oakover is incredibly important to us. But let's look at, we build the plant first, capture the opportunity. We use a third-party ore to do that to begin with. And then as we expand our sulfate plant, that should be perfect timing for Oakover to come in and feed into it. So the key thing there was Wei's done a fantastic job in China in terms of we've managed to secure the right people. We've engaged a gentleman called Mr. Joe. He's been in the manganese sulfate industry for 20-odd years, from when it was a very small baby to where it is now. But he's a very good blend of chemical processing engineer and just a mechanical engineer. He looks at things and how can we improve its process and how can we improve its cost. So, we're very lucky. We've brought him in on the company. He's now a COO of China. We've acquired his patents, his IP. That's all flowing into our process that we're putting forward into China. So, we've got the right technical team on the ground, very experienced. And, again, back to my comment about our process we developed in Australia to make sulfate was complex. What we've now brought it down to is a very well-oiled, simple process. Yeah. But there's lots of little bits of secret sauce in there that, we're protecting ferociously. But, it's all about being competitive, being able to survive in all, price cycles. And so that's why, part of the other reason of being in China, our Western peers need prices that are 3 times the current market price to really make their projects work. And so, we're a little bit more, I guess, realistic in terms of where we see the future price and what then cost base we need to survive in that future price space. Okay. And so, we've got a process, like I was saying, so the Mn3O4 complements the manganese sulfate. Typically, the hardest things to get out of manganese when you put it into solution is calcium and magnesium. And so There are ways you can get it out, but like, so for example, most people in China will use fluoridation. And so that's using a fluorine acid in there. It drops out the magnesium content. But what happens is you end up leaving the fluorine behind in your solution. Cathode manufacturers, battery manufacturers don't want fluorine in your solution. So you then have to do another step to get rid of it. Mr. Joe's come up with this process where we don't do fluoridation. We remove the calcium and magnesium through other processes, makes it less harmful chemicals that we're using, makes our whole residue process that to be able to consume it by cement factories, etc. And so it really drives that low operating costs. In China, in a chemical park, you're not allowed to have residue.
Yeah,
it has to be. You either have to process it so it can be consumed by somebody, or it comes out consumable by somebody. So you've got a sort of a zero waste process. So just by the fact of the law, it really drives a different way of thinking. Like here in Australia, we don't have those secondary industries to support that kind of process. If you think about our residue goes into cement basically in China. Here you need a big secondary industry to drive cement to be able to have all this feedstock going into it. And if you're making it in the Pilbara of Western Australia, there isn't that cement industry. No. So you end up having to then treat it and bury it. So there's all those sort of advantages to going into China as well. So the other thing we've done very well is, so we've got the technical know-how. We then found a great location. We found this chemical park in a place called Jinshe in Hunan province. Jinshe is in the northern part of Hunan. It's ideally situated. It's a big chemical park that's been running for a number of years. There's 100-odd chemical producers already in the park. It's on what's called the Lishe River. The Lishe connects to the Yangtze River. You can't beat low-cost transport than what's on the river in China. So from that perspective, all the the raw material that comes in, very low-cost transportation for that. We've got acid production, what we need. We found, we use a lot of steam in the process. That literally, the steam plant is 500 metres away from our proposed land. So it gives us everything within 150 k's of where we are. There's about 3 million tonnes of LFP, either in production or under construction. And again, if you take those ratios and those forecasts, like half of them converting to LMFP, that's 1.5 million tonnes. You could call it 1 million tonnes of sulphate demand within 150 k's of us. Our 70,000 tonnes is very quickly dwarfed.
Yeah.
So the land offers all that. The government, local government, there's been incredibly supportive. We get a tax support structure where we get 100% of local taxes back in the first 3 years, and then 50% back in the next 3 years.
Oh, wow.
We then get the incentive to buy the land. So they're going to rebate us 62% of the cost of the land 60 days after we purchase it, unconditional. So in rough Aussie dollar terms, the land will cost us $10 million and we'll get $6.2 million back in 60 days. So a lot of support. So that puts the land very, very cheap and very competitive. And again, the other benefit of when you go into a chemical park is all the permitting. Most of the permitting is 80% complete. What we have to complete is just project specific permitting. So we're now working on there's 3 big key ones: environment, energy, and safety.
Yeah.
We're just on the verge of getting the environmental one. The energy one is a few weeks away, and so that we're getting all the permitting required to be able to then go to the next phase. On the project as well. So just to recap, so we did a feasibility study on third-party ore. US $83.5 million capex, US $10.7 million working capital. We've been talking to banks, and again, Way's done a fantastic job with these banks. Big 4 Chinese banks. China Construction Bank has given us a non-binding indicative letter to do 50% of our capital, and then 70% of our working capital. The way that we get that from non-binding is we get our permits, we own the land, and then the official process starts. But the other thing that's really great is the Chinese government kind of gives signals to the banks about what industries they should support and what industries they shouldn't support. And LMFP is one of these industries that
they've given the tick of the approval.
Correct. And so by being sulphate as a feedstock into LMFP, it goes a long way to the banks helping us to get that support. So if you think, So we've kind of got 50% of the capital now well advanced. We've also engaged, with a company called China Chemical. So we signed a strategic cooperation agreement with them earlier this year. China Chemical is this massive state-owned company. It's been around for 70 years. It's built something like 90,000 chemical plants over that time.
Jeez.
So it's built just a couple.
Just a handful.
Yeah. But it's built, like 95% of all chemical parks in China. They actually built the Jinshe Chemical Park, and they actually maintain the Jinshe Chemical Park. So we saw there was this natural synergy of partnering with those guys. So they'll do the civils and construct, is what we're planning on doing. We've negotiated an agreement with them where they're happy to defer 20% of the civils and construct costs until 12 months after we reach commercial production. So, if you add that into our 50% of capital, we're kind of teetering on 60% of our capital requirements sort of sorted out. So the idea now is then, obviously we want to keep developing the project, pushing the story, and look how we make that next step into owning the land, and then obviously go into final investment decisions.
Yeah. So, I mean, for the environmental and then safety and energy, I guess, permits, do you have any indication or timeline as to when those...
So the safety one's done.
Safety is done.
Environmental, I've been told it's imminent. Okay. So there's a process where it goes through an expert panel review, and then it goes through government, and you kind of go through. You can go through a couple of reiterations on that. So the environment's gone through all that. It's gone through all its final approval. It's gone through its exposure period. It's now just waiting on the desk for it to get a stamp. So hopefully that should be any day now we get the environmental one. The energy one went through that cycle a couple of times with small reiterations required. We've now gone into the final exposure period on that one. So that's like a good 3-4 weeks away once we get through that exposure period. So we'll have all the permits in place. Then the next big step for us is to own the land.
Own the land.
Yep.
And then that gives the ticket of approval from the bank, and then you get arguably 50% of your capital for that.
Correct.
And then, I mean, that's de-risking the project down to, the final investment decision as well.
Correct. And I mean, like when you think about it as well, by using a third party ore to begin with, it's also de-risking our supply side. We're talking to mines that have been in operation for 50 years, big suppliers. So, we're sort of de-risking the project as much as we can through the process, either through the technical know-how, partnering with the right people. The design institute that did the feasibility study and is doing the preliminary designs, all very experienced, have built 4 sulfate plants in the past. China Chemical, we're trying to bring the right group of people to make sure that it's, very smooth process through construction.
Okay, and then again, assuming that all this unfolds, then the next step naturally is getting the rest of the funding to then build the plant.
Yep.
And then I'm sure that you guys have got indications of when that or how long that might take as well, or is that a bit more processing or consideration on your end as well?
Yeah, look, it's probably in next 6 to 9 months we see that. So realistically, we've just got to get through these next phases. There's other things that we're doing as well. Like, again, we're always very cost focused and conscious. So we've built a pilot plant to demonstrate the process of producing sulfate and Mn3O4. It works. It's producing 10 kilograms a day. We've had a European OEM come and visit us for looking at the process as well, and looking to see how we can discuss potential supply in the future. We've had investors there. So that's all working our way forward. We also, though, then recently, the front end of a sulfate or chemical plant, you always need a roast reduction step, if it's lithium or manganese, whatever it is. And so in our case, you'd heat that ore up to 900 degrees, and then you'd cool it down to 60 degrees, so over the space of like a 60-metre tube. All that energy it takes to heat it up to 900 degrees is lost at the far end when you're cooling it down. Mr. Joe just looked at that and said he had an idea, and basically it's just recapturing that heat to preheat the ore as it starts the roasting process. And crazily enough, nobody else has thought of it. So we patented it. We then went looking and talking to existing large producers of roasting calcining, rotary calciners. And we ended up with a company called Sunwood. Sunwood's a very large construction company. I think it's top 50 in China, of the sort of significance and importance that the president visits the plant and all that sort of stuff. They kind of laughed a little bit like when we said, we've got this great idea. When we showed them the technology, they were fully on board. So we've now signed an agreement with them. We're partnering in building a 1/15 scale pilot plant for that. So it's going to be like 15 metres long, a metre wide tube. We're going to process like 50 tonnes. So a significant size pilot plant. But we've also then agreed on the basis of that, of the data that comes out of that, and we're so confident, and they like the idea so much, they're prepared to give us a 5% royalty on revenue.
Yes, I did see that in the announcement.
On any future roast reduction kiln that uses our technology. And it's really amazing. Since that, we've had so much interest come out of other chemical processes, other industries going,
we want to apply it to us.
Yeah, could we use it in our industry? So we're very keen to get the pilot plant for that up and running, get that test results out, and then we see there's a lot of synergies we can use to move that forward as well. But probably the most important thing on that is it will drive our cost base even lower. So the cost base we've indicated from the feasibility study is $608 a tonne. That will come down from this basis. So we're working to try and just, like I said, in all phases of the market, we need to be competitive and we need to be able to be profitable. So,
and it puts you in a good spot because, as we're seeing at the moment, the volatility of some of these commodities and resources does put some projects arguably completely on the shelf, and they don't become financially viable. And I think all the strategies here of just keeping it as low as possible is much, much more beneficial long run and alleviates hopefully some of the stresses of market fluctuations, which we're never not prone to.
Exactly. And I just feel, my own personal opinion is starting a business reliant on subsidies, both on the capital and the operating side, is destined for tears because, how long will they last? How will, if you've finally got a business that's not cost competitive, it shouldn't really exist.
No. So it's sort of fakely put in motion.
Look, and that may upset some people, but that's. I think, that's reality. We just see that, like I said, China's so much part of the manganese sulfate demand. The process has been well established there. We've got the right people on board. We've got the right technology. We think we've got advantages over other producers in China by what Mr. Zhou is bringing to the table in terms of all his patents and etc. So we really think we can drive that cost base.
And as I said at the beginning, there's the two-pronged approach because all of this is unfolding in China, but then you've still got the Oakover project, and that's where you alluded to. You're still working permitting and some of the processes there, but it's a giant resource or asset that you're building up and hopefully bring into mine. But what's unfolding there? What have been some of the recent activities on site?
So so we've been doing all the flora, fauna, subterranean fauna, aquatic fauna studies. So they've you got to do them over 2 seasons. You then got to do targeted surveys depending what they find. There's a multiple step process that we're going through that. We're working our way. We've just taken the approach that we must be very steady and steadfast, I guess, in just one step at a time, and just keep on going with Oakover. The trick for us is trying to develop 2 fronts at once. We just need to be very conscious of how we step. We don't want to spend all our money and then wake up one day and go, oh. So we're just doing Oakover very steadily, very structured as we go. Like I said, we've been negotiating native title royalty side with the traditional owners. That's coming to a conclusion soon. We've got good outcomes coming through that process. Oakover just keeps on moving forward. And realistically, at the moment, we just see the opportunity is the sulfate plant in China. So we're just pushing a little bit harder on that side. But we announced yesterday that we had farmed out a couple of non-core manganese assets. And the logic behind that was really it costs money to maintain these things. You've got to explore them. You've got to develop them. You can't just
put money in the ground as
Correct,
well.
Yeah. And so Macro are keen to be able to do that. It allows us, I should say, to focus on Oakover and China, Jinshe. But we've still got our foot in the door in terms of it's an 80-20 farming arrangement. Whatever they find, we'll still be a part of. We think. They've got the right sort of technical skills. Simon Rushton's got significant operational skills, from his MinRes days. So, we see that they're very good guys to be able to run that forward, but it really saves us money and allows us to focus on our two main projects. That was the logic behind doing that.
Thought process. Yeah. So you can see a lot of the attention naturally is on the China and building up the project, and as we said, hopefully getting all the ticks and everything sorted so you can get the funding. But I mean, encapsulating this entire conversation, if there's 3 key takeaways that you would urge investors or listeners just to remember, encapsulating what we've just talked about, what would those 3 key takeaways be?
Okay, I think we offer the best exposure to the growing manganese demand in batteries, and we do it on a basis where we've got the right operating costs and the right capital intensity. People can perceive that China is a risk, but I think from the investor tours that we've taken on, once people go there, their eyes are firmly open and they just see the potential of China and they believe the project. I guess, right thematic, right cost base, and the right technical team would be the best 3.
There we go. And for those that are interested in reaching out and learning more, contacting the team and following Firebird, where can they go and how can they reach out?
So there's some contact details on our webpage. More than happy to speak to anybody anytime. Those contact details come through to myself. We can then sort of just talk from there, and I'm happy to sit down and chat with anybody.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. It's we've covered a lot of ground, and there's going to be a lot more unfolding in the next 12 months, and I'm sure I'll be keeping an eye on it and hopefully get you back to fill me in on the updates and the listeners. But thank you so much, Peter, for speaking on the show today.
Thanks, Ben. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the Marketable podcast. Please remember that the topics and stocks discussed in this podcast are not financial advice. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, share, and follow. You can follow The Marketable on all our socials and keep up to date with global market insights.